The words to that song say, I could be still, I could sit, and I could wait. I could hold on to who I am and never let you change me from the inside. And then we get to that chorus that says, but you have called me higher. You've called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me. I love that song. And those are words that I need to hear on a daily basis because it is so easy to just be comfortable. It is so easy just to stay where I am and not ever actually look at changing what I do and how I operate. And yet that's the way we grow in our faith. That's the way we get closer to God and closer to each other is through going deeper and through stretching and sometimes even through difficult situations and hard times. Well, good morning. My name is Julie, and I'm one of the pastors here along with Rich. And as Rich said earlier, we are starting a new sermon series today about conflict. Now, as an Access team, we wanted to make sure that we are really in this series with you. And so I'll shed a little bit of light on that. We decided earlier this week that we would give the icebreaker earlier about cats or dogs. And had a little bit of conflict of our own in our meeting because I am a cat person. So we all have conflict, and I'm hoping that we can maybe model some healthy conflict for y'all too in the coming weeks. Maybe an example being that I didn't tell Rich that I was going to light a match on stage today, so we may see how he responds to that later this week and keep you posted. But Rich, I need you to know that I used to do this a lot as a kid, and there was only like a handful of times that it went bad. Yeah, we're good. So we're good. So I used to light matches a lot as a kid. Did anybody else do that, or was that just a weird Julie thing? Yeah, okay, thank you. So I used to light matches a lot as a kid, and then when I was in high school, I was in a theater production called Little Match Girl. And at the very end of the show, there was this part where I was supposed to light the match, hence the name. And so there was this line where they said, "Light the match, Liesl." And I took the match, and I went to light it, and held it up in the air, and nothing happened. And went again, and nothing happened. And about 10 seconds later, I realized that it was on the wrong end. And someone finally leaned down to me and said, "Turn the match around." So when you light it from the right end, you see a spark. It's interesting to me about how matches work. Smoke detectors. It's interesting to me how it's a lot like conflict, right? If you don't know how to use it the right way, it can be really ineffective. If you don't know how it works, it can be pretty detrimental. But if you do know how it works, it can bring light. It can bring warmth. We decided to do this series around conflict because we realized that conflict is something that is inevitable. It's something that we deal with in our interpersonal relationships on a daily basis. It's a part of our families and our marriages. It's part of our communication prospects with our work communities. It's something that we deal with all the time. And if it's not something that we deal with, it's something that will deal with us. Because a lot of us, 80% of us actually, are conflict avoidant, which means that we really would prefer not to stir the pot. Or I'll put it to you a different way. We maybe wouldn't prefer to stir the pot interpersonally, but we're fine with doing it maybe online, maybe at our computers, maybe in texting. And as I began to look at what this series might look like and what we would want to talk to you about, I began to realize that we really struggle to talk to each other in a way that works. We struggle to understand each other. We struggle to know what other people are thinking. And so we either do one of two things. We either avoid it altogether, which is completely unhelpful, and we're left in the dark, or we use it in a way that's completely detrimental, that's painful, and that doesn't give life and light to our relationships. So our hope is in this series that we light the match, and we maybe see how it works. And hopefully we can give some tools and some examples of some ways that we can do conflict in a healthy and hope-filled way. Now, the reason we decided to talk about conflict is, well, because Jesus had conflict. In fact, much of the scripture and the stories that we talk about in scripture, Jesus is the one starting the conflict, which is really irritating. So today, in the midst of a challenging series, we decided to pick a challenging text. And I want to read to you what the Gospel of Matthew says, starting in verse 34 in chapter 10. This is Jesus speaking. He says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." What? There are very few scriptures that I would like to just skip over, but this is one of them. Because this is not the Jesus that I am used to hearing about. This is not the Jesus that I like to see or think about. And if I'm being really honest, this is the Jesus that goes too far. Right there in that first verse, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth." No, that's exactly what I thought that you were doing, Jesus. "I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." So instead of ignoring this text altogether today, we're going to dive a little bit deeper and maybe see what Jesus meant by that phrase. "I have come not to bring peace, but a sword." It's found in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus is commissioning the disciples. He's telling the disciples what it means to be a disciple and what their task will be among the people as they go out from Galilee. And so right before these verses, he's talking about things that might come in their way, things that they might find in terms of persecution or people who will stand against them. He begins to tell the disciples that this is going to come at a cost. It's not going to be easy. And at the very end, as we heard just a minute ago, he says, "Take up your cross. Lay down your life so that you might find it." But he talks about this sword right here in the middle. And I wonder, if we're talking about swords, we can't not talk about the sword of Excalibur, right? It's the coolest sword, so we have to talk about it. So if we think about the sword of Excalibur in King Arthur, that sword is not as much about weaponry. It's not used for war. In fact, it's a symbol. It's a symbol of authority, of power. It's a symbol of him being a king. You know who has the sword is the one who's the king. And so what Jesus is talking about here is maybe not violence and about disruption, but instead maybe what he's talking about is this understanding of power and authority. And like Jesus always tends to do, he links it back to the cross at the very end and says maybe the way you understand power, maybe the way you understand authority is a little bit different for me. And if you're a follower of Christ, maybe this is a kind of power that you should emulate. A power that's about self-giving and service, about giving all of yourself and who you are, one that relies on this love that is relentless. And so what he's saying to the disciples here really talks about what we talked about in the first song today, that song, "I Surrender." To give your entire life to the work of Christ, to surrender your life for the work that you're about to go do. It's a sharp message. Like a sword, it has edges. And it's not something that is easily passive. And so what Jesus says in this scripture is, peace is maybe something that's important, but it's not my first priority. My first priority is love. And if love is my first priority, is self-giving, if seeking justice for those who are poor and powerless is my priority, then peace is a byproduct of that. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. A new understanding of power that might help us to understand the way in which we communicate and help each other and love each other as human beings, as people who are children of God. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. So he tells this to the disciples, and then he tells them that they are to choose God even over their families. That what they're choosing might come at a cost. It might come at the risk of losing friendships and people that are dear to them, but that is something that they need to be willing to do. This is a thing about trust. Jesus is gathering a team together. And in this team, he has to know that he can trust these people. There's a book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and in it, Lencioni, who's the author of this book, talks about this pyramid of dysfunction. He talks about it from the opposite side, but I want you to see the pyramid up here. And what I want you to see is what's at the very bottom here. Even before conflict, even before there is a lack of commitment, accountability, inattention to results, the foundational work that is here at the bottom that makes for an effective team or an ineffective team has to do with trust. If you cannot trust the people that you are working side by side with, just like Jesus was working with the disciples, your effectiveness is lacking. So how do we begin to trust each other? How does Jesus know that he can trust the disciples? I don't know about y'all, but I don't trust people that I can't be honest with. And if I can't be honest with people, I can't be real with them. And it seems as though there is this interplay and the connection between vulnerability and trust. That if you are able to trust someone, you are able to be real with them. But if you're not, you're more likely maybe to avoid conflict. You're more likely to ignore things that are important. You're more likely to disregard the things that are priorities. But if you trust someone in the way the disciples trusted Jesus, you might just work harder. In fact, you might even take up your cross. You might lay down your life. Trust is crucial in this conversation about conflict. In fact, it is the foundational piece of what we are talking about. Because if you cannot talk to someone on a level that is vulnerable and real, I don't know that you can honestly do conflict in a healthy and appropriate way. But trust takes vulnerability. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase, speak the truth in love. I don't know about y'all, but whenever I hear that phrase, speak the truth in love, sometimes I've heard it and it's not exactly truthful or loving. I wonder if that phrase, speak the truth in love, instead should mean something about the way in which we care for those that we are speaking to. We desperately, at the very core of who we are as human beings, desire to be understood and we desire to belong. And so everything we do centers around that. The way in which we handle conflict centers around that. We all have different needs about wanting to be wanted or needed or liked. We all have different desires about wanting to achieve or do good. And yet, at the very core of who each of us are, is this desire to belong, to be understood. But that's difficult. Because oftentimes we try desperately to be understood, yet we don't often pay a lot of attention to understanding other people. So I find it this interesting interplay in our interpersonal dynamics, how desperately we want to be understood, yet the time in which we take to really understand someone else is often very minimal. And so that's where we start today. We start a conversation about lighting the fuse about conflict with understanding. Understanding ourselves, but with a desperate desire to understand someone else. To build that level of vulnerability and trust that is difficult and that is real. To be at a place with people where we can be honest about where we are. Brené Brown says that vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they are never weakness. That sounds a little bit like Jesus' words about a sword. Courage and vulnerability may not be comfortable, but they are certainly not weakness. It takes strength to be in real relationships. It takes strength to be in conflict with other people. And so Jesus doesn't avoid conflict. Instead, he tells us, engage. But do it in a way where you are seeking not only to be understood, but to understand other people. To build a level of trust with people where you can see them for who they are, and maybe you can be seen for who you are as well. There's a book that we're going to be referencing several times throughout this series called Fierce Conversations. And there's a quote in it by the author Suzanne Scott. She says, "Everyone wants one person in the world to whom they can tell the truth and from whom they will hear the truth. Become that person." Maybe that's our goal today. Everyone desires to be able to be honest and speak truth and to have someone that will speak truth to them. But that doesn't happen without trust. That doesn't happen without vulnerability. And vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. So maybe we have an opportunity to be courageous today.